With new tariffs on the horizon, the American automaker faces a potential financial storm that could impact everything, from production to pricing. The stakes have never been higher, and despite confidence-building statements, Mary Barra is perfectly aware that tariffs pose their toughest challenge yet. The GM CEO enters panic mode over Trump's tariffs, and as things are about to get wild, no other options but desperate measures are left. Let's take a closer look. Panic mode engaged. It's needless to say that automakers are worried about their future in the US market. Trump's administration may have an idea to strengthen domestic production and innovation, but the thing is that new tariffs lead to rising costs and uncertainty that they create. In reality, cost increases and market disruption are what's coming next. So you may presume that automakers are in a panic moment right now. We can refer to Ford CEO Jim Farley, who stated that despite a lot of talk about making the auto industry stronger, all we can see is a lot of costs and a lot of chaos as a consequence of new tariffs. The GM CEO, on the other hand, plays cool and tries to stay positive, so we can hear pretty neutral statements like the one when the GM CEO, Mary Barra, evaluated the impact of the steel and aluminum tariffs on their business, saying GM sources a significant amount of both from the US. At the Wolf Research Investment Conference, Barra said, "We are prepared, and when we know exactly what's going to happen, we know the steps we could make." The thing is that GM has fixed pricing on such purchases, but still, that's only short term. If tariffs persist soon enough, the time for new agreements with suppliers will come, and then things could get out of control pretty easily. GM's CFO, Paul Jacobson, said that if tariffs are prolonged, the company could take additional measures, such as shifting production of vehicles and their parts. Barra, on the other hand, also stated that GM has contingency plans ready for tariffs, saying that the company can avoid up to 50% of additional costs without deploying any capital. That's true, but only short term. In the long run, GM will, just like all other automakers, face big trouble because there's a whole army of GM models assembled in Mexico and Canada, let alone all those suppliers of all kinds of parts. Mexican-made army. In the automotive industry, there aren't many things that sound more American than Chevrolet and General Motors. But the reality is that GM hasn't been the most American automaker for decades, and that even numerous cars produced by Japanese or Korean automakers are more American than their GM counterparts. GM has a long history of outsourcing production to Mexico. Believe it or not, it all started way back in the 1930s. While things escalated after the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. GM expanded its Mexican production significantly, benefiting not just from lower labor costs, but new trade advantages and established supply chains as well. Things went to the point where GM reached 750,000 vehicles assembled in Mexico on an annual basis. Today, GM has multiple plants operating in Mexico and produces an impressive range of models. For example, the Coahuila plant produces Chevy Blazer and Equinox, while the Silao plant is responsible for two of GM's most important models, the Chevrolet Silverado 1500 and the GMC Sierra 1500. We could also talk about the San Luis Potosi plant, or maybe the famous Toluca plant that has been operating for a full 6 decades, where GM produces engines and other critical parts. Altogether, there's a whole army of GM models produced in Mexico that will significantly impact production costs and retail prices once the new tariffs come into power. Things aren't much different in Canada either. Yes, production in Mexico is at a greater scale, but Canadian plants will play an important role in this tariff mess as well. The good old Oshawa plant has been in business since 1953 and still works at full capacity, producing light and heavy-duty pickups like the Chevy Silverado. The Cami plant, on the other hand, is crucial for GM when it comes to electric commercial vehicles, while the St. Catharines propulsion plant has been producing engines and transmissions for GM models for more than 7 decades. North America is one big GM factory. The thing with these 3 countries, particularly the US and Canada, is that their auto industries are deeply intertwined. General Motors relies on a complex cross-border supply chain for some of its most profitable models, particularly large SUVs and trucks. And to show you how complex things can be, let's take apart an engine called crankshaft as an example. This integral part of every engine, in GM's case, starts its journey in the United States, but then undergoes rough machining in Canada before returning to Michigan for final refinement. Moreover, while some crankshafts remain in the US, others make another trip across the border, right to Windsor, where they're used for engines built in Canada. And that's just one of more than 30,000 parts every internal combustion car has. So it's hard to even count how many times one specific component can cross borders before reaching its final form. That back and forth movement of parts is a closely guarded aspect of automotive manufacturing, and most automakers and their suppliers avoid sharing specifics. The whole process includes hundreds of suppliers contributing to various components that are refined and assembled through multiple stages. According to some expert estimates, a single auto part can cross between the US, Canada, and Mexico up to 8 times before being fully integrated into a vehicle. Although it may sound complex at first, it's actually a pretty effective method that GM uses to reduce costs and streamline production. So once the tariffs come into power and this complex supply chain gets disrupted, you may presume that consequences for GM's production and further vehicle pricing will be significant. Relocation is the key. As GM CFO Paul Jacobson said, if tariffs persist, relocation will be GM's strategy for absorbing the massive impact of tariffs. In that way, Chevy and other GM brands would remain able to form more or less competitive prices. Many assemblies would be moved back to the US, while the existing ones would increase production capacity. The mitigating circumstance in GM's case is that its production is diversified. We can take the Chevy Silverado 1500 and the GMC Sierra 1500 models as an example. The two models are produced both in Silao, Mexico, and Fort Wayne, Indiana, while Sierra is also built in Canada. Other manufacturers have their trucks produced entirely in Mexico, like the Toyota Tacoma, so you may conclude that GM has a tactical advantage over competition in the way that it can relocate production faster. Instead of starting from the ground up, GM would rather focus on its American plants and try to increase capacity. That definitely is a big advantage of the competition. But one way or another, all this requires massive investments. The only problem that GM might have is the lack of money, as the company is under tremendous financial pressure due to its commitment to electrification. Among legacy automakers, GM is among the frontrunners in this aspect and already has an impressive EV lineup, with most of its brands already being involved in the process. But like every other automaker, there's no word about profitability at the moment, so GM might have taken too big a bite. So it might not have enough resources to navigate other operations, like plant relocation and other tariff-related moves. New Chinese tariffs will affect GM in billions of dollars. Besides 25% tariffs on all products from Canada and Mexico, Trump also imposed new 10% additional tariffs on imports from China. And while that is going to affect a pretty small number of US vehicles, these tariffs will primarily affect auto parts rather than whole vehicles. GM is one of the most impacted automakers, as models like the Buick Envision, for example, although sold in the US, are mostly made from Chinese parts. But things are even more critical when it comes to EV programs. Battery and related parts are a much greater concern because the US in total is importing $20 billion in transportation goods from China each year. And as one of the frontrunners in the sector, it's needless to say that GM's share in all of this is significant. The impact of these tariffs on consumer pricing is still hard to estimate, but most industry experts have no doubt that additional costs will most likely be passed on to buyers, at a time when new vehicle prices are already historically high. The average transaction fee for a new car is already at around $50,000, so GM officials, like all other companies, are afraid that further increases could dampen demand. On the other hand, with its global control of critical materials, China will undoubtedly remain a crucial player on the supply chain, particularly for electronics and battery technologies. And since this engagement is practically impossible, it's pretty clear that GM will have to figure out how to offset these extra costs. With the massive strain coming from the electrification program, it's clear that GM doesn't have too much maneuvering space, so we may all conclude that an uncertain future is coming. Not just for GM, but for other car makers as well, because they're not in a much better situation either. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.